So it's come to my attention that Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand how the federal debt and federal budget deficit work, which probably won't surprise a lot of people in our audience. You might remember, or you might not, that a while ago it really wasn't clear whether Trump understood the difference between health insurance and life insurance. I don't know if you remember this, but at the time we covered it. Donald Trump said to the New York Times back when he was interviewed in July of 2017, quote, "So pre-existing conditions are a tough deal. Because you're basically saying from the moment the insurance, you're 21 years old, you start working and you're paying $12 a year for insurance. And by the time you're 70, you get a nice plan. Here's something where you walk up and say, I want my insurance. It's a very tough deal, but it is something that we're doing a good job of. So that is a description of life insurance. What's called whole life policies accrue value over someone's lifetime. And when Trump talks about $12 a year or $1 a month, that also is confusing because that's usually the price for term life insurance, not whole life insurance, which doesn't accrue value. So it was just like completely whacked out. Trump seemed to be talking about health insurance, but he described whole life by quoting prices typically associated with term life. And the conclusion I came to was this guy doesn't have the slightest idea what he's talking about. That gets us to this weekend. It seems that Donald Trump is confused not only about health insurance versus life insurance, but it seems he also is confused about the federal budget deficit versus the trade deficit, which is extraordinarily scary because Trump ran both on fixing the trade deficit and the budget deficit. He hasn't done either. He's actually made both worse, and he doesn't seem to know the difference between the two. This is really, really weird. Two times late last week, Donald Trump said something that was the sort of thing that normally like an 11-year-old who's just starting middle school might say because they're only starting to learn the basics about how the world works. Trump was asked about the federal deficit, the federal budget deficit, revenues versus expenditures, surplus versus deficit, not the trade deficit. Trump gave an answer about the trade deficit and tariffs, which has nothing to do with it. I mean, just it has absolutely nothing to do with what Trump was asked. Take a look at this.
You mentioned all the economic indicators are going up. Why then is are U.S. deficits and the national debt increasing at a time when...
Well, the trade deals won't kick in for a while. You know, number one, the USMCA hasn't even been approved yet. It has to go before Congress and get approved. Now, it should get approved quickly. NAFTA was one of the worst deals ever made. During the campaign, I said I will either terminate NAFTA or negotiate a new deal. And we negotiated a good deal. Now, if you went back to pre-NAFTA, that would be frankly okay with me, pre-NAFTA or the new deal, but I won't allow NAFTA. NAFTA was a horrible deal for this country. You look at the scars all over our country where you go to New England, you go to Ohio, you go to Pennsylvania, you see what happened in North Carolina. You have factories that are still empty from what happened with NAFTA. NAFTA was a horrible deal. The USMCA is a great deal. But pre-NAFTA, we had huge surpluses with Mexico. With NAFTA, we have huge deficits. We lose $100 billion a year on trade with Mexico. Does that sound good?
So let's be super clear here. The answer has nothing to do with the question. Trump was asked about why is the federal budget deficit exploding? And he says, well, some of the tariffs haven't kicked in. USMCA, a trade deal hasn't been signed. NAFTA is a disaster, and we used to have a trade surplus with Mexico. The question was, you claim that all economic indicators are up, yet the U.S. deficit and debt are going up, which is the opposite direction we want them going. Of course, it's relevant because Trump campaigned on reducing that. And Trump says, well, the trade deficit isn't down yet because some of the deals haven't kicked in. That's not the same deficit, Donnie boy. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Why we would at this point, I don't know, but give him the benefit of the doubt. Imagine that he didn't hear the question correctly or whatever. A few hours later, he's interviewed by the New York Times, and it's the exact same nonsense again. Trump is asked whether he might keep the tariffs even if he makes a so-called good trade deal with China, and he responds, quote, yeah, sure. We have 25% now on $50 billion. And by the way, Peter, that's a lot of money pouring into our treasury, you know. We never made 5 cents with China. We're getting right now 25% on $50 billion. And then I was putting 25% at a later date, which date came and went 25% or 200 billion. You might not have any idea what Trump is talking about there. But again, he's talking about tariffs. Trump is talking about tariffs generating money for the treasury, which figures in to the federal budget deficit. This is not how it works, okay? Tariffs are paid by American companies to Chinese companies if we want their goods for import. Now, if you want to go by the letter of this, there are some customs duties that can come from tariffs, but they are very small. They're less than 1% of all of the taxes collected by the Treasury. It's basically a non-factor. The Chinese people aren't paying the tariffs. It's whoever imports the stuff from China that pays the tariffs, meaning mostly American companies. And again, Trump is talking about tariffs as if they're going to deal with his blown up federal budget deficit. There's a bunch of articles that notice this, and they wrote, it's unclear if Trump understands the budget deficit. It doesn't seem unclear to me. It seems perfectly clear that he doesn't understand the difference between the trade deficit and the budget deficit. And you would think Trump would know a lot about debt, since he and his businesses have had such debt problems, but he doesn't seem to get it. And when you think back and remember, this is the guy who stared directly at a solar eclipse. Does anybody think that he is up to date on the intricacies of revenues versus expenditures? I guess not. And it's really embarrassing. And the biggest problem with this is not that, I mean, listen, it's stunning that the president doesn't understand this stuff. At this point, it's not surprising. But the way in which his followers will blindly defend him and say they were trick questions, or the transcript has been doctored, or the video is a deep fake which can't be trusted, or whatever, he just doesn't seem to get it. He doesn't seem to know the difference between life insurance and health insurance. He doesn't seem to know the difference between the budget deficit and the trade deficit. He just doesn't know. And then it's up to us to decide whether it's acceptable to have a president who doesn't know that stuff. You tell me.